Brazilianist. So I started to work on the studies of Brazil and Brazilian law here at Yale 53 years ago. And about the same time, I started working at FTV, where I did my first empirical research project, which was on the Brazilian capital market, and also helped to develop an innovative legal education reform project that led many years later to the new law schools, one of which Sergio is the dean of, and the others in São Paulo. Thanks to the vision of Carlos Ivan, the FGV decided to launch law schools, which it did not have until 2000, and that changed my life because I have sort of become an informal member of both faculties, and Rio and São Paulo. Not a bad deal. They don't pay a lot, but at least I get to go to Brazil rather regularly and continue working. Now, Confessions of a Brazilianist. I have had several roles in American academic life that have given me an opportunity to try to build Brazilian studies in law and related fields. So I've been a law professor ever since 1967, and I've also had administrative roles, both here at Yale, later at the University of Wisconsin, where I was Dean of International and Area Studies and was in charge of all the area programs as well as the global programs at Wisconsin for 11 years. And then after I retired from Wisconsin, I became Senior Research Fellow at Harvard, and I was co-director of a program on globalization, lawyers, and emerging economies, and I'll get to that in a minute. So in these roles, I have had both successes and failures. And I think they speak to some of the problems and the potential of Brazil studies in my field, which is law, political economy, and economic development. So as a law professor, I failed to create a course on Brazilian law. Now, I wasn't alone, because there are, in fact, as far as I can find, not one course on Brazilian law in the entire United States. There was one at Miami, but taught by a friend of mine, Keith Rosen, who also spent time at FGV in the 60s, but he's retired and hasn't been replaced. But I did manage to create, first at Yale and then later at Wisconsin, I continued it, a course on law and development with a Brazil module. So we studied law and development not just in Brazil, and it didn't require a knowledge of Portuguese or Brazilian law. We produced information in English for the students, and that got students. Because of course, a course in Brazilian law, if people don't speak Portuguese, what are you going to teach them? So that's part of the problem of teaching Brazilian law. But tying Brazil to some other topic like law and like development and law's role in development was successful. I also have been successful in teaching Brazilian students both in the United States, in Brazil, and in mentoring and co-authoring, including with my colleague here, an article on exactly the topic he just talked about, which is the importation of American legal institutions into Brazil as part of the privatization. So there we come full circle. Okay, so that was my successes. Now, when I was chair of the now defunct Law and Modernization program at Yale in the 60s and early 70s, we developed the idea of a course in law and development that came out of that program, and that allowed us to build Brazil material along with Indian material and Chinese material. Over time, of course, the content changed, but we always had Brazil in there. And I was able to bring leading people studying Brazil from other countries who knew about Brazil, and also Brazilian scholars. And I'm very proud to say that the Yale program in Law and Modernization trained Bolivar Laumanier, and Bolivar de Souza Santos. Both of them were fellows in that program and went on to become important figures in Brazil studies of various types. As a dean at Wisconsin, I failed to maintain Brazilian studies when Tom Skidmore left Madison. Now, you probably don't know, his name was mentioned this morning. Tom Skidmore was the father of all Brazilianists, and he was a wonderful guy, and he was a one-man Brazilian studies program at Wisconsin, and he brought people and built things around them. Of course, Wisconsin has, and has for long had, one of the top Portuguese departments in the country, so that was a base. But when he left as Dean of International Studies, the history department, where he was, did not want to replace him with a Brazilianist. They wanted somebody to work on Chile. And I was incapable of doing anything about that because, like almost every American university, not everyone, but almost everyone, the positions are in the departments. And if the department doesn't want a historian in Brazil, too bad. If political science decides they'd rather do China with a slot that comes open, they do it. And that is one of the dilemmas of maintaining Brazil studies in American universities, is the fact that except for a few positions in a few schools that are earmarked for Brazil or under the control of the international, what we call the senior international officers of the university, you're at the mercy of the vagaries of what particular departments are interested in, and there's fashions, and they come and go. So that was a failure. But we did create research networks, again, recognizing that the best way to get people in American universities to get interested in Brazil is to relate it to something else, to environment, to climate change, to human rights, to development, to whatever. And that worked at Wisconsin as well. And finally at Harvard, where I've been the director of this program on studying lawyers, and I'm very proud of this because I think this is really a great success. We created exactly what some of the people in the first panel spoke of, interdisciplinary, multinational teams doing collaborative research, in this case on the rise of the corporate legal profession in Brazil. This was part of a 3-country study. There's an India study and a Brazilian study and a China study, and here it is, the Brazilian legal profession in the age of globalization. Edited by Luciana Gross Cunha, Daniela Monteiro Gavai, and Jose Garcés Giraldi, David Trubek, and David Wilkins. So the Davids are Americans, and everybody else is a professor at FGB. So I think that this, and we had a team of 50 people working on this over a 5-year period. Research assistants, junior faculty, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that's sort of a life's experience. All right, now, what can I take of a more general nature from this experience? So the first is, I've already told you, that people don't study Brazilian law in the United States. So I did an informal survey just in the last couple of days, and as far as I can tell, there is in fact not one course taught in one American law school by anybody called Brazilian law or anything like that. There are a few law professors like myself who read Portuguese, who follow Brazil, who are interested in Brazil, and teach, somehow bring Brazil into their teaching, but not in a course on Brazilian law. There's a program on Brazil and the environment at Pace. My colleague David Wilkins always uses material on Brazil in his courses on the global legal profession. Dan Brinks at Texas, who's a lawyer and a political scientist, talks about human rights in Brazil. And there are many other things like that. But that's the way you really can break through the barriers, the language barriers, the lack of student interest in Brazil, such, at least in law, these days, and so on. So where do we go from here? I think that's the title of the program. What does it say here? The road ahead. Where is the road ahead? Rocky, I'm afraid, but nonetheless promising. So what is the road ahead? Well, I think, and Carlos Ivan said when we were chatting during the break, Brazil is at a turning point, at a very, very clear. It's clear that it's turning, but it's not clear where it's turning and how far it's turning and to what. So this causes anxiety and concern in some quarters, and in others it seems that some are happy with the changes. And some are happy with some changes and unhappy with others. So you could be happy about the economy and unhappy about other things, or vice versa. But the point is, it is a liminal moment in the history of this country. And it's a moment in which Brazil is going through things which are going on around the world and which are of great interest to people in the American Academy. Things like the fate of democracy, the role of the judiciary, the future of human rights, the nature of environmental governance, the ability of law to protect the environment, or not, to preserve the rights of minorities, and so on and so forth. These are all questions that are big questions. They're questions that in the American Academy are important. Brazil fits in within this narrative in the sense that it is a country that offers promise and also despair. And it seems to me that time has come to launch a new version of Brazil studies in our field, which would be interdisciplinary. Again, one of the lessons we've learned from our colleagues in the previous panel, would be led jointly by Brazil and U.S. institutions, rather than being some sort of, U.S. dominated institution. And I'm very proud of the fact that this study was jointly negotiated between Harvard and FGV, and would focus on important issues, interdisciplinary teams, where if we could recruit American scholars who don't read or speak Portuguese, but Brazilian scholars who do read and talk English, or vice versa, we can get through the barriers. And I think that there's a tremendous opportunity to study things like, how do you preserve democratic institutions in a time of rapid change? What's the role of judiciary? How do electoral systems, we have a little bit of this issue at home, in case you haven't noticed, and we certainly would be able to discuss our own problems in these areas. We talked about law, politics, and the environment. That was already well covered in the previous session. Human rights, what about criminal justice, the rights of defendants, free speech, minority rights, and so on and so forth. These are topics on which one could develop a tremendous amount of new interest in Brazil, in the United States. And I think that we're here at a perfect time, and we've got the perfect kind of environment. I think FGV could take a lead. Carlos, listen up. Yale could play a very important role. Listen up. Because there is already interest at the Yale Law School in Brazil, although the faculty hasn't engaged as much as the students have. But after all, the students, are what it's all about anyway. And there is a program where Yale students spend time at FGV and USP in the summers, right? So there's a little, and it's just the sort of thing I have in mind, and that's a little thing you could build on. And there's lots of other places and things. And here's the professor of Brazil studies in Oklahoma, so we can have a southwestern branch. So I think this could be great, and I hope you'll all pick this up and run with it.